All right, Facebook, we are live and we are back. And I'm glad that you are back here with us. So I have a very special, we were, by the way, we took some time to do some praying. We were praying for our nation. We are also praying where we are seeing a rise of anti-Semitism here in the United States. We're praying for what's going on in the nations. In our fellowship, we were praying for what's going on in our nation where the deportations are concerned, and there's just been so much anger and chaos. We were praying for that. And there are some things that my wife raised that brought us to prayer. So that's why we took some time to do that. What we're doing here now is I'm going to be sharing with you an interview that I did with Dr. Kenneth Waters. Now, last week in our Who's the Boss series, I shared with you another view on First Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15. And that was the view of Dr. Kenneth Waters, where I talked about his book also. Let me bring this book up again. This is his book here, Women's Salvation and Childbearing, the Mystery of First Timothy 2, uh, 11 through 15, which, by the way, I highly recommend. This is one of the books that I highly recommend that you get. You can order this off of Amazon, either as a Kindle or get a hardback. I have both. And I highly recommend this book to help you to understand another way and another way of approaching First Timothy 2:15, which helps you to understand what it is that Paul was writing about, what it is that God was communicating. And so what I did, I taught on that last week, shared an overview of Dr. Walter's interpretation of First Timothy 2:15. What I also did a few months ago is that I interviewed Dr. Waters. And in the interview, we discussed this book, Women's Salvation and Childbearing. And we also discussed several other things, which I didn't really get into a whole lot in my teaching last week. And I realized I didn't have to because we discussed it in the interview. So we talked about how he came to this view that childbearing in First Timothy 2:15 is referring to virtue bearing. So we talked about that. We talked about the Jewish and Greco-Roman background for this view. Now I did cover that somewhat last week, but you're going to hear me talk with him about this again. We also talked about, because I was curious about this, how does if it was possible, how does Artemis of Ephesians connect and fit into his view? And he actually does talk about that in his book, and we talk about this in the interview. So you know that I interviewed Dr. Sandra Glahn. We talked about her view. And we talked about her book, which you can see back here, Nobody's Mother. We talked about Artemis of Ephesians as a possible background for for the interpretation, giving us more insight into 1 Timothy 2:15, helping us to better interpret it. So I was wondering how Dr. Waters, how would does he even bring in Artemis of Ephesians, which he does in the book? We talk about this in the interview and how that connects. It's going to be really interesting. So listen for that. We also talk about, and we're going to briefly touch on how First Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 through 15, and in his view that childbearing is talking about virtue bearing, how this all connects. We're going to touch on this briefly, how that all connects to First Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, and the qualifications for being an elder. We're going to touch on that. Next week, I'm going to talk more about that in more depth and in more detail. So this is going to be a great interview. So let me set this up for you, and I hope you get a lot out of it, and I hope you enjoy it. Let me see. Let me do this correctly here. Oh, I just did something wrong here. What did I do? Oh, I just lost my. Okay. How did I do that? Hang on, folks. I had it all set up and I pushed the wrong button. And now I can't find my. Hang on. How in the world did I do that? I know it's here. I know it's here because I'm looking at it, but I can't find it on my. Okay, I'm going to have to set some things up here. Just give me a moment. Let's see if that'll work. Yes, there we go. Okay, I got it now. All right, here we go, folks. And again, this is going to be my interview. Let me set this up here. Yeah, my interview with Dr. Kenneth Waters. And I'll be back when it's done. It's going to be about an hour and 20 minutes. Here we go. All right, everyone, welcome to Live from the Oasis. This is Mike Davis, and I have a special surprise for you. As most of you who've been following me know, we have been teaching on 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15 for quite a few weeks now. We've looked at a variety of different interpretations of that text, and I have settled on at least two that I think have the most plausibility to them based upon the arguments of the authors. And there is one that I'm going to share with you today. Probably by this time you see that as I've already shared it. And today I get a chance to interview the author of one of the views, Dr. Kenneth Waters. He has written the book, which I have referenced, Women, Salvation, and Childbearing. It's by Dr. Kenneth L. Waters. Just to tell you a little bit about him. He is professor of New Testament and Associate Dean of Personnel, Contracts, and Undergraduate Studies at Azusa Pacific University. And he has published extensively on the Gospels of Paul. He is here in Southern California, which is where I live. So happy to hear that. We're actually not that far from one another. I know I'm in Chino, California. And are you in Moreno Valley, Dr. Waters?
I'm in Highland, California.
Highland.
The Inland Empire, as we're called.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're all close. Part of the Inland Empire.
Yeah. We're close. We're close.
Yes. So I am very happy to have him on here today. So we're going to jump right into this and talk about what I consider to be a very unique, very plausible interpretation of 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. Matter of fact, let me just read that real quick, just to start off here. And this is the New King James Bible. And Paul in verse 15 says, nevertheless, well, I'm going to start at verse 12. And Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. And verse 15 is what we've been looking at. One of the things, Dr. Waters, you told me I could also call you Ken, is that verse 15 is a verse that many believers, scholars say, this is very difficult to understand, very difficult to really interpret. It's like, what is Paul talking about here? And one of the things I have argued, I was like, however you come to this text, you got to be humble, you got to be gracious, because there's a lot of complexity to this and actually the entire passage. But I read your work, as I said before, I came across your work reading another scholar who referenced you favorably, and I started looking up your articles, and then I came across your book. And I read it and I thought, okay, I've got to include this in my information. And then when I found out you were here in Southern California, I thought I got to contact him to see if we can interview him for our live broadcast. So what I want to start off with is just by asking, in a nutshell, we're going to expand upon it. How would you describe your view or your interpretation of 1 Timothy 2:15?
When Paul uses the term childbearing, in 1 Timothy 2:15, he is not speaking literally of the bearing of physical children. He is talking about the producing of metaphorical children, namely the very children or virtues that he mentions in that verse of faith, love, holiness, and temperance. These are the children that women will be saved through childbearing. Now as we're going to point out, men also have the same requirement. To give birth to faith is the same thing as being saved by faith. So we're talking about the use of an allegorical metaphor here, similar to the way Paul uses the term fruit bearing. And actually, if Paul had used the term fruit bearing instead of childbearing, which he could have done, we would have been saved generations of anguish over this particular verse. But that's what's going on in this verse.
Okay, so from your perspective, your interpretation of this, the childbearing that Paul is speaking, he's using in an allegorical metaphor of bearing or producing. The children are virtues, not literal children. He's not speaking of a literal verse. What led you to this unique interpretation? Because as I shared with you before, and those of you who follow me, I have studied this a lot, and I've seen the different interpretations. Not once did I come across yours until I read that one particular scholar. What led you to this?
Well, one day I was just minding my own business and reading the works of Philo of Alexandria, who, by the way, is a first century Hellenistic Jew, just like
Hmm.
Paul the Apostle. And like Paul the Apostle, he uses an allegorical interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures, particularly the book of Genesis. So by reading through his volume, I came across this theme of his. I call it the virtues as children theme. The idea that the soul gives birth either to virtues or to vices. So it's also a virtues or vices theme. But in his writings, he speaks about biblical characters like like Sarah, who gives birth to Isaac. Sarah represents virtue in his thought, and Isaac represents eudaimonia or happiness. Hagar represents education. Ishmael represents learning, and he consistently does that with biblical characters. And so it's this idea of virtue giving birth to virtue,
Hmm.
or the soul giving birth to virtue. So something clicked in my head, and I remembered, there's a place in the pastoral epistles that this might have relevance for, and that was First
Hmm.
Timothy 2:15, and that's how I really got into it. And then from Philo, I got into Plato, where that same theme appeared. In fact, that's where Philo gets it from. He gets it from Plato, and then Plato gets it from his previous Hellenistic environment. I see the same theme in the Gnostic literature, and it's just and even in other parts of the New Testament. So the theme, the idea of the soul giving birth to virtues as if they were children, is a theme that kind of appears everywhere in the world of Paul the Apostle.
Wow. Okay. So it was in reading Philo, you started it clicked in your head. One of I likened it to when I first started really studying more deeply. We were studying, my wife and I, what we people now call the Jewish roots of Christianity. And some of my teachers, they would talk about how the rabbis would study. And one of the teachers, a guy by the name of Joseph Frankovic, he said, the rabbis, when they read scripture, they're like blind men reading Braille. And when they come across something, they'll stop and they go, wait a minute, why is that there? And they'll start linking it. And it seemed like that's what happened as you were reading Philo. There was a connection in your brain
Yeah,
with, wait a minute, this is something that seems to relate to what Paul was writing about in his epistles.
yeah. As you're reading, sometimes things will click. they,
Yeah.
they just click, and then you start doing the deeper reading, the deeper looking, and you go from one thing to another. Then all of a sudden, this coherent picture emerges, and it just kind of takes it kind of. Oh, I hate to say I was obsessed with it, but I was obsessed with it,
Okay.
and I worked with it, and then that led to me writing some things up and sending it off for publication and presenting it in conferences. And actually it's been a wonderful, enlightening, and
Yeah.
enriching experience. Just and of course they call it discovery, in research, and discovery is a wonderful thing, and you just continue to learn more and more about a particular subject. And that's what happened in the case
Okay.
of a particular. Of course, the fact that the verse has been a problem for so many
Yes.
generations contributed to that. So there's this added excitement of finally being able to solve a hermeneutical problem for the sake of the community, the academic
Yes.
community, and the church community. And
Okay.
that just added to the thrill and the excitement of this research.
Good. So what I'm going to do kind of for the rest of our time together and asking questions, I play a little bit of devil advocate because there has been pushback on
Sure.
your view, and I've
Yeah.
collected some of the pushback, sent you the pushback so that you would know what we're going to be talking about, and I would love to get your responses to it because, and for those watching, I think this is such a very important interpretation and point of view that needs to be recognized more by the church. like I said, I'm surprised that it's not more widely known. So one of the things that, as I was doing my research, there are scholars who say who push back against it. Well, there are no contextual clues or indicators in verses 13 and 15 that would alert readers that Paul is using she shall be saved by childbirth in an allegorical, metaphorical manner. So what would be your response to say, well, Paul doesn't signal that he's using this in an allegorical manner. So that
Yeah,
can't be
well,
it.
on the contrary, there are clues. There are
Okay.
clues, and there are indicators that this is an allegorical use of this term. The first clue is the fact that if we interpret the term childbearing literally, we drive at a contradiction,
Mm-hmm.
in Paul's thought. Paul teaches very strongly and very clearly that we are saved by faith, not by a work, by childbearing, and he especially teaches that men and women are saved the same way, by faith. So the fact that we have a contradiction there is the first indication that there's more going on here than meets the eye, below the surface. So that's the first thing.
Okay.
The second thing is that we have to interpret Paul in his own literary and cultural context. And that's something that many scholars are failing to do in the case of this verse. When we go into Paul's literary and cultural context, that is where we discover the key, to this verse. And of course, the key is this virtue as children's theme, which is pervasive. It's pervasive in Paul's literary and cultural, context. So that's the second thing. That's about important. And then the third thing is that childbearing here is connected to salvation.
Mm-hmm.
So that alone forces a metaphorical reading of of this verse. Now Paul does use the terms, child rearing,
Mm-hmm.
and childbearing elsewhere, but never does he connect the term to salvation. That is another
Mm.
indicator that there is more going on here than meets the eye. And then another indicator is that you do have Paul using a synonym for childbearing, and that synonym is fruit bearing, or the idea of,
Mm.
of, of fruit bearing. And of course, when Paul speaks of fruit bearing, he speaks of us bearing the virtues of
Right.
the spiritual virtues. So there are indicators all over the place, but of course they are hidden from us because of our own cultural conditioning. One of the things we need to realize and acknowledge is the distance between us and the biblical text,
Right.
which forces us to build a bridge between us and the biblical text, and to really get into the biblical text and context, in order to understand what Paul is saying here.
Right. Okay. So, and I agree with that 100%. I think that's something that sometimes, as I have read different material dealing with First Timothy chapter 2, especially the question of women and what they can and cannot do, what seems to be ignored to me many times, and for me, this as an egalitarian, on the complementarian side, the cultural context, the historical context, and sometimes even the literary context seems to not be attended to very closely. So I agree with you. If we're going to read Paul, we have to read him in his context. So my next question would be that we know, and you brought this up already, we know from the New Testament, and especially from Paul's epistles, that Paul often is using an agricultural metaphor to speak of virtues as fruit. We see this in Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit. In Ephesians, he talks about the fruit of righteousness. We see it in Matthew, there's wisdom shall be justified by her children. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
so
yeah.
we see this there. Here's my question. How well would the metaphor of virtue as children been known to a first century audience? Was it a common metaphor?
Yes, it's what we call a commonplace. It would have been uh, well known and very familiar to Paul's first audience,
Okay.
especially that audience in Ephesus, which is the context of First Timothy. Paul is writing to Timothy, the bishop of Ephesus. And Ephesus is the center of Artemis worship. Artemis, the goddess of fertility and childbirth. The temple of Artemis was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. So you have a cultural context where birthing imagery and language is used all the time, as we see in other works like the writings of Plato. So the use of this kind of birthing imagery and language, this what you might call natalistic and post-natalistic language, would have been very familiar and common in Paul's culture, and we know that by reading the other literature. A rough analogy would be the way that today we kind of use sports imagery and sports language all the time, because sports kind of infuses our culture. So when someone says that Pastor Davis hit a home run with his sermon last Sunday, they know that you were not up playing baseball in the pulpit. They know that you preached a dynamic and meaningful sermon, and they automatically know that without anyone telling them. So the same thing is true in that type of culture where you're in the center of a religion that centers upon the work of a goddess of childbirth. That you have that same kind of imagery and language being used all the time. So Paul's audience would have immediately recognized what he meant when he said, "Women shall be saved through childbearing." And by the way, when he uses the term "women," he is speaking of those women specifically in Ephesus. Those Ephesus women, Eve, she, they, all those pronouns refer to the women of Ephesus. It's a very, what we call, context specific application. And they would have immediately recognized in that day and culture what Paul meant by childbearing. They would have recognized that he meant it as a metaphor, as an allegorical metaphor for the soul giving birth to virtues.
Okay. So what I hear you saying is that when it comes to reading Paul, period, but especially reading this, we can't dismiss your interpretation on the basis of we might miss it here in the 21st century.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Because what, and I'm going to ask you about this in a moment. Paul tends to use an agricultural metaphor, but just because he doesn't use it here doesn't mean, just because it's not being used there, and that we don't get the other metaphor doesn't mean that he's not utilizing it just because we don't see it, just because we don't get it. Because the people in that time period would have gotten it, they would have understood.
Yeah, and they would have understood that the reason why Paul is using childbearing instead of his usual fruit bearing is because he's talking about women.
Yeah.
And women attract the metaphor of childbearing. And it's the same thing that happens when Philo talks about the female members of the Egyptian monastic movement called the Therapeutai. When he talks about them having immortal children. In other words, giving birth to virtues. Well, he could have used the term fruit bearing in that context too, but he's talking about women, and women are not fruit trees. So the use of women attracts the metaphor of childbearing, and that so it's interesting that the same thing that Paul is doing here is happening in his older contemporary, Philo of Alexandria.
And one of the things you say in your book is that Philo uses both metaphors. He uses the gynecological one as well as the agricultural one. So he goes back and forth.
He goes back and forth. He uses them interchangeably, just like Paul does. That's an example of how what we call extra biblical background informs what Paul is doing in his own writings.
Yes. Well, and also too, because when I was reading your book and I was thinking about this, because I remember when I first read it, I go, well, Paul normally uses in agriculture, he speaks of fruit. But then I thought, well, and I said to myself, well, wait a minute though, Mike. He's talking to first century people.
Yeah.
They would have gotten this metaphor. In terms of vices, vices are also spoken of as children.
Yeah.
And we definitely have in James, where James talks about sin, that
Yeah.
desire, when it is every man is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desire, and when desire hath conceived,
Yes.
it brings forth sin.
Sin, yeah. And sin, when it's conceived, gives birth to death.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's the parallel theme of virtue giving birth to virtue, or vice giving birth to virtue, or the soul giving birth to the vices, just like it gives virtue. So you see that theme also in Philo, and also you see it in Plato. In fact, this is basically where everyone gets it from. They get it from Plato, this natalistic theme, and you see it in the Gnostic literature as well. So again, yeah, you have the positive and the negative, but where the soul gives birth to either virtue or vice, and that would have been a commonplace, a very familiar idea in that day in culture. We basically call it virtue ethics. But that's the base. That's the foundational idea.
I know in your book also you reference Matthew and Luke when they talk about wisdom being justified, and I was looking at it again last night. Wisdom being justified by her children.
Children, yeah. Luke says by her children. Matthew says by her works.
Works, yeah.
And the common error is to portray Jesus and John the Baptist as the children of wisdom, but that doesn't fit the cultural context.
Right.
In the cultural context, it is Mother Wisdom who gives birth to the other virtues. So you have Jesus, who is showing philia or friendship when he eats with sinners. And you have John showing the virtue of temperance when he abstains from eating and drinking. That's the idea of wisdom giving birth to these virtues, either in Jesus or in Paul. So Matthew speaks in terms of works. Wisdom is justified by her works, namely the works of Jesus or the works of John the Baptist. Or in Luke's version, wisdom is justified by her children, namely the virtue of philia in Jesus, and the virtue of sophrosynne or temperance in John the Baptist. That's the idea of wisdom giving birth to the other virtues there.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point, because so once again, we're seeing that across this literature. We see it in the Gospels, we see it in Paul, we see it in James, that there is this idea of being able to give that childbirth could be used as a metaphor for birthing virtue.
Right. And you see it. Actually, you also see it in Judaism as well. For example, the apocryphal work of Joseph of Asenath, where repentance, a daughter of God.
I was reading it last night.
Yeah, and of course I mentioned Philo and the Therapeutae, where the women give birth to immortal children, namely the virtues. So you see it in the Greco-Roman world, you see it in the Jewish world, and you also see it in the early Christian world. So it's a pervasive theme, and it's just been overlooked by us 20th and 21st century moderns, because that's not our world. The world of Paul is alien to us, and we need to recognize that. That doesn't mean that world is irrelevant to us. It just means that we have to do a better job of building the bridge between our world and their world, in order to understand the impact of the words of Jesus and the words of Paul upon their first hearers.
Yes. I always like to use the illustration when I was growing up, and I was raised by my grandmother, who was one of the parental figures who raised me. And there are times if she got upset with me over something, she would say, "Boy, you don't believe fat meat's greasy." And when I have taught in different places and we talk about idioms and understanding culture,
Sure.
I said, now you can go look up all of those words in a dictionary and it
Yeah.
will not tell you what that
But
idiom means. You
that's
have to
right.
grow up in my culture. You have to grow
Sure.
up in my household to understand. Because my grandmother never sat down and said, "This is what I mean when I say this." But hearing
Yeah.
it so often, I knew contextually what it meant.
That's
And
right.
if she used a certain tone, it could,
That's
the
even
meaning
more.
could change.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And you have to keep in mind, on those same lines that Paul's first audience had an advantage that we do not have.
Yes.
They actually had the lector, the appointed
Yes.
person who would carry Paul's letter to the community and read the letter. I mean, unlike us today, the reading of a letter was a public event,
Mm-hmm.
and there was always
Mm-hmm.
a designated lector. So when that lector read Paul's letter to the community, he would use gestures,
Yeah.
facial expressions, movement. In other words, he would
Yeah.
dramatize.
He performed the letter.
That's it. He would perform. He would perform the letter. We don't have that today. We don't have that
Mm-hmm.
today. So we lose a lot in the translation of Paul's letter into modern times today. But all those silent as well as audible messages would be communicated in that
Yes.
moment to the congregation.
Yes.
So even if the congregation missed something, that lector would be able to fill in the gaps.
Very good point. Very good point. We could really go off on that because I think that's so important is that there are things that we are missing that we are unaware of that we read it silently. We read it, with a certain tone in our own head or no tone at all. But when the letter is being uh, read in the first century, whether it's to Timothy or to an audience, it like you said before, it is there's a it's with drama. It is being performed, which contributes to the meaning in the
That's right.
interpretation of the text.
Yeah,
Whew,
that's right. Yeah.
we could really spend some time on that, but we're gonna move on.
I know you've got a long way to go here.
Yeah. Okay.
But
So
I do need to say this.
yes, go ahead.
Just one more thing.
Yeah.
Another thing we miss, Howard, is the context specificity of Paul's letters. We tend to universalize the particular
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times when, for example, in this particular case, Paul was just dealing with that particular situation in Ephesus
Mm-hmm.
when he said to women to submit yourself in silence
Mm-hmm.
to your. He did not mean that for women every place, everywhere, for all time, but just for that
Right.
specific situation in Ephesus. Same with 1 Corinthians 14:34. Let the women keep silent in the church. I
Mm-hmm.
do not permit the women to speak. He did not mean that for women everywhere, every place, for all time, but for those particular women, because he was dealing with a problem.
Right.
A problem of misconduct in worship in the case of Corinth, or the problem of false teaching in the case of Ephesus and Timothy. And that's another thing that we tend to miss. We tend to take what Paul said and kind of blow it up and make it
Yes.
apply to every time and everywhere, when that's not what Paul intended. He
Right.
intended it for that particular congregation. So that's part of bridging the gap that has to occur between
Yes.
our time and Paul's time when we're interpreting his message.
That's and what you just said is so important. It's one of the things that amazes me when I have listened to others teach on this passage. And I've heard so many. I've gone on YouTube and listened to message after message, and often the context, the historical, the social context tends to be kind of ignored, and people
Sure.
will, like you said, they'll universalize it. Yet I'm amazed that they will take 1 Timothy 2:9, where it talks about the women not having braided hair. And I thought, no one goes to church and say, okay, all you women with gold on or wearing your hair braided, y'all are out of order. I said,
Yeah.
matter of fact, they tend to explain it by, well, God is not concerned. He's more concerned with your inner,
Sure.
which is the constant interpretation I hear. And I go, no, Paul said, let it not be the braiding of the hair. So I said, but contextually, what was he dealing with? And that tends to be ignored.
Yeah, and that makes us consistent with
Yes.
how we apply the scripture today.
So very good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Again, we could spend a lot of time on that.
Yeah, we
So
could.
in your book, you provide an abundance of evidence to show that the metaphor of virtue as children was displayed, as you said before, in the Hellenistic literature and Plato, Philo. So you show that there really is a very strong foundation. And by the way, as I said to you earlier, just to let the audience know, I looked up all your references. I got my Philo, got out Josephus, I looked up Plato online and looked up every single one. I went, yeah, it's there. It's definitely there.
Yeah.
However, one of the things you state is that even though there is this strong foundation, you said that a direct knowledge of Plato or Philo as a way for accounting for 1 Timothy 2:15 is not needed or necessary in terms of the concept of children or virtue as children or childbearing. That you are not saying therefore that Paul was directly reading Philo or Plato, and that's why he came to that conclusion. Why is it? So the question, my question is, why is a direct knowledge of Philo or Plato or other Hellenistic literature not needed to prove Paul's use of the concept?
Yeah. I was responding to a kind of a more subtle point there. There are those who want to say that I cannot say this
Yeah.
unless I'm able to prove that Paul read Philo or that Paul read Plato. And what I'm saying is, no, we don't need to prove that Paul read Philo. I do believe that Paul was at least familiar with Plato
Yeah.
because Plato was everywhere in that,
Okay.
literary speaking, in that culture. And it's not out of the ballpark that Paul may have been familiar with Philo, because after
Hmm.
all, Philo was a Jew, just like Paul was. He was a
Right.
Hellenistic a Jew, like Paul. So it is possible that he
Okay.
knew Plato and Philo. But what I'm arguing is that it's not necessary to prove that he knew Plato or Philo, because the idea of virtues as children was pervasive in that culture. So even if Paul did not know Plato and did not know Philo, he still would have been inculcated with that theme. He still would have encountered that theme, and the members of his audience would have. In fact, the members of his audience were embedded in that theme. They grew up on that theme as virtues as children. And of course, Philo got it from the same place that Paul got it from, the culture, from the culture. And
Right.
Plato also got it from the same place, from the culture. So in other words, the theme is what we call a commonplace. The Greek word is konos topos. It's a commonplace, and it was just in the air. It was
Hmm.
the atmosphere of Paul's cultural and environment. So that's what I mean. Uh,
Okay.
just that alone is to show that alone is enough. We don't have to show that Paul went into his office and read Philo or I don't need to show that. Um, uh, you know, it's likely that he did that, but I don't
Yeah.
need to show that. Yeah,
And we can see another thing is that Paul does show awareness of Greek poets,
he does.
and the ideas that were floating around. And like you said, also too, that it was in the air. One of the things that I've studied is Paul's use of rhetoric, and practically all scholars that I've read, where Paul's rhetorical use of different techniques and things, they'll say, well, it doesn't necessarily mean that Paul went to rhetorical school, because these things, as you said, was in the air. He would
Yeah,
have breathed this. So it could have been that he was trained formally. It doesn't have to be. Same way, like as we're saying here, it doesn't necessarily mean that, like me, Paul went and looked up all the references, but he could have read, he could have been familiar with it, but it was definitely this metaphor was in the air.
that's
One
right.
of one of the things you talk about is the influence of the Ionian philosophers
Yes.
and their relationship to Ephesus. Could you, because Paul is writing a letter to believers, or to Timothy, who is in Ephesus. What's the significance of these Ionian philosophers?
Yeah, the Ionian philosophers, they were the ones who took the imagery of Homer and Hesiod, those great Greek lyricists, and they kind of translated it into allegories. So in a way, the Ionian philosophers were the founders of allegorical interpretation, and of course, and that led to the influence upon Plato, upon Philo, and everyone who came afterwards. And one of the things that the Ionic philosophers focus upon is how creation itself is the result of somebody giving birth. Giving birth to creation. Now, usually it was a god or a goddess or someone who gave birth to creation, but it was that idea that creation comes about through somebody giving birth. Now, of course, in Hebrew religion, it's totally different.
Right.
God does not give birth to creation. God creates out of nothing. So you have that idea in Hebrew, but that idea pervades Greco-Roman culture, and Paul's audience were Greco-Romans.
Right.
I mean, that's
right.
Paul. I mean, Paul wrote in Greek. He wrote in Greek. So, and one thing about Paul, for example, 1 Corinthians chapter 9:20, I become all things.
Yes.
So Paul was well versed in meeting people where they were.
Yes.
And he would use their upbringing, their cultural idioms, he would use their cultural images and formation as vehicles for his message. And that's what's going on. That's what's going on here. So it's not that Paul believed that creation came about as a result of a birth by a goddess. But he would recognize the fact that his audience were kind of brought up on those Greek myths, those Greek stories, and he would use those to his advantage.
Yes, I agree. Because one of the things we see Paul do in the book of Acts, like when he notices that there was an altar to an unknown God,
yeah,
he makes use of that. It's not a huge leap to say, well, Paul is going to make use of these things that they are familiar with to communicate a message.
Yeah. That's what he does. That's what he does. That's what he does. And
yeah.
And that's just part of recognizing what you just said. We don't have any idea of what Paul's formal education might have been, except that he was raised at the foot of Gamaliel, and he was trained to be a rabbi. But Paul was very proud of his Roman citizenship. So it's hard to believe that he would not have also been well versed in Greco-Roman rhetorical techniques and imagery. In fact, he kind of shows that in Corinthians and in Romans. One of the things he does all the time is he used a technique called prosopopoiae, or what we might call impersonation. Impersonation. He would impersonate an opponent and then debunk him in the next sentence. He does that all the time in Corinth and in Romans. That kind of shows that Paul has had some training beyond his Jewish heritage.
Yes. Okay. So one of the things, this is so good. I can say on every one of these points, we could do a whole hour. One of the things you reference in the book, and you referenced it earlier, is the cult of Artemis in Ephesus.
Sure.
And her status as the patron goddess of childbearing, which is something for our viewers I've taught on this. How does this fit in with your view that Paul is speaking metaphorically? And I really want to connect it to what you talk about in the book of Socrates and his use of the Artemis. So if you could talk about that.
Yeah. The point there is that Paul is actually doing the same thing that Socrates is doing. He's using the Artemis legend, the legend of Artemis, as the founder of the midwifery guild to frame his message of being saved through giving birth to the virtues. That's exactly what Socrates does in Plato's book Theaetetus,
Mm-hmm.
and Socrates does that, and then Socrates describes himself as a midwife for the souls of men. So it's important to note that this childbearing theme applies not just to women, but to
Mm-hmm.
men as well, and that's where the egalitarian theme comes in at.
Mm.
Not only must women be saved through childbearing, but men must be saved through childbearing as well.
Mm-hmm.
Men also give birth, not of course, not physically, of course,
Right.
but spiritually, at the metaphorical level, we give birth to the virtues. So what we see here, using Plato, and Plato is the one who talks about Socrates.
Mm-hmm.
So using Plato and Socrates as a frame of reference, we see how Paul is using that same kind of frame of reference, particularly since he's writing in an Ephesian context,
Right.
a context centered upon the worship of Artemis, to basically make the same point about how necessary it is for the soul to give birth to these saving virtues.
So, okay, so to bring them back again, so Socrates, well aware of the story of Artemis and well aware of her status as a patron goddess of childbirth, uses that as a frame of reference to begin to talk about giving of birthing virtue, that he himself acts as a midwife to men to help them to give birth to virtue. So we are seeing already, even before Paul, that this was being utilized.
Yeah, we're seeing how the Ephesian culture itself, because Socrates is
Yes.
also writing in the context of Ephesus,
Yes.
how the Ephesian culture has impact upon a particular teaching style.
Yes. Yes.
And that's what's happening here. I mean, why does Paul talk about being saved to childbearing there, and he doesn't talk about it somewhere else? Well, he does
Mm-hmm.
talk about it somewhere else, but
Oh, good point.
in terms of fruit bearing, but he's
Yes.
talking about it there, and because of the Ephesian context. So the Ephesian environment kind of calls forth a particular approach to this theme for Paul. He's writing for an Ephesian congregation.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Okay, so we've talked about this. There have been criticisms, objections, rejections of your view. In
Sure.
your book, you highlight two scholars in particular, Elna Moulton and Ellen Van Wold, I believe her name is pronounced.
Yeah.
What for you? What was unique, first of all, about their critique, and then what was your problem with their critique?
Yeah, I mean, what was unique is that they actually engaged my article, and at the time this was the article, not the book.
Yes.
I
Oh,
yeah
your
the
article. Yes. Right.
yeah my article. The article was a 2004
Mm-hmm.
article. So yeah, they were different in that they actually engaged my book for at least a couple of pages.
Now,
Uh,
can I stop you right there? Why is that unique?
that's unique because the work was usually ignored,
Yes.
or dismissed in one or two sentences,
Mm-hmm.
which I could talk about, but I'm not going to talk about that.
Well,
I
I
can
did want to
complain about.
mention it for just a moment because I've read some of them, and what you said is correct. When I've read people who have dismissed your view, it's usually one or two sentences, and then they move on.
Yeah,
And I'm going, and every time I thought to myself, that's not a very good argument against his view.
sure,
Sometimes it
yeah,
was just like it was simple, something as simple as it just doesn't work. I'm like, what do you mean?
yeah, and no one proves it. No one
Yes.
demonstrates what's wrong. And I know what's going on there. Again, if my thesis was accepted seriously, yeah, it would kind of render obsolete a lot of reflection upon First Timothy that has gone before. And also, there are a lot of people in scholarship who are just wedded to this idea of the patriarchal Paul, the chauvinistic Paul. They are so strongly wedded to that idea that they have kind of built their reputation upon that idea. So
Mm,
Paul comes across very negatively and
hmm
chauvinistic and patriarchal and sexist
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of scholarship, which is contrary to all the evidence that we see
Yes.
about Paul. I mean, Paul mentions Prisca and Nympha and Phoebe and Syntyche and Euodia and Mary and Persis, all of these women that he mentions as co-laborers, as
Mm-hmm.
ministers, as co-workers and fellow prisoners with him. Paul has a very positive and egalitarian
I
view
agree.
of women in his scripture. But yet you have the school of scholarship that just wants to dismiss all of that. And what I do is I bring all of that to the fore. So that's one reason why my work gets
Yeah.
rejected. Probably the main reason why why it gets rejected. But also because if my work was taken seriously, it would require a
Mm-hmm.
rewriting of all the commentaries, all the literature that has come before on the pastoral epistles, particularly First Timothy
Yeah.
chapter 2. So contrary to that, these women, Moulton and Van Volte, they spent some time with my article. So that was much appreciated and kind of rare in the scheme of things. The problem I had with them is that they expressed this fear that people in modern days would not recognize the allegorical uh, uh, interpretation of childbearing in First Timothy 2:15, and because of that, I might have unintentionally just set up another hierarchy, like the literal hierarchy that we're battling against. So I was confused by that because it's kind of beside the point, and I think what was happening is that they were conflating the modern day audience, namely us, with Paul's first century audience. And the point I keep making is that Paul's first century audience would not have the same problem that we have today in the 20th and 21st century. They would have immediately recognized the allegorical interpretation, the use of technogogia, for childbearing, and First Timothy 2:15. Yeah, we today in the 21st century need some coaching and some education on
Right.
that point, but they did not. So I think the mistake that Moulton and Van Walte made was conflating us with them, and I keep arguing, no, don't conflate us with them. They are them, we are we, and we are the ones that have the problem, not them. They would have immediately recognized Paul's allegorical view.
Yes.
That's what they grew up on.
Yes.
That's what they were imbibed with. They know what Paul was doing.
And I think that's a problem today that people make is that they will conflate our 21st century world with the first century world. Uh, there is a particular YouTuber you and I were talking about earlier who's been teaching on women in ministry, and he was kind of putting down the idea or kind of making fun of the idea about letter writing and letter reading in the first century as it related to was it Phoebe, who, many scholars believe that she may have carried the letter to Rome. And when she uh, carried the letter, she may have been explaining the letter, which would have made her one of the first interpreters of the book of Romans.
Yeah,
And there are scholars who have given some background about letter writings and how letters were carried and how they were delivered.
yeah,
And this YouTuber was like, you know, how difficult is it to find somebody, just take your letter and take it and then you read it yourself. You don't need anybody to explain it. And I'm going, again, you are conflating
yeah.
21st century experience
That's right.
with first century. They're not in the first century. So in the
That's
same
right.
way, these scholars that you referenced, they were, saying that, well, it might confuse people. They may, and it's like, but wait a minute, these are first century. This is a first century
That's
audience.
right. That's right. Yeah, yeah. For one thing, letter writing was a whole different kind of experience. For one thing, they did not have easy access to
Right.
paper and pen, and of course we don't do that anymore ourselves anyway. But they certainly did not have access to it. I read one scholar who said that he estimated that a letter like Paul's letter to the Romans would be the equivalent of about $3,000 to
Mm.
produce today. I mean, that's how hard it was to
Hmm.
get a letter written, and then you had to get it delivered. So it wasn't like you just get a letter and you sit down and then you write a letter back and you send it. You know, that's erasing the distance
Yes.
between
Yes.
us and that time, and that's just such a common misstep in the
So
interpretation of the Bible.
so we've had two scholars at least who engage with your work over about, I think you said about 2 pages, even though you said you wrote to them and thanked them for
Yeah, yeah,
doing that. So
yeah,
that's
correct.
great.
Yeah, I
Because
did.
even though you disagreed with them, you thank them for
Yes,
at
right.
least engaging it.
I engage it. Yes, yeah, and
Good.
and 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 and, and you know what more should you expect? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, if to kind of dismiss something is it's just unprofessional. I don't know a better way a
Hmm.
better way to put it. But I have to call them on that because to this day, like I said, I wrote the article in 2004, the second article in 2007, the book in 2022. I mean, to this day, no one has been able to show why my argument is untenable. They
Hmm.
just haven't. And I don't think they are able
Hmm.
to do that, and they should at least acknowledge that.
Okay. So I do have one person I want to bring up, and I sent you the thesis of this particular gentleman, but a guy by the name of I think Anthony Daw. He was working on his Master's of Art in Biblical and Theological Studies.
Yeah,
He cites your two articles. I don't think he cited it all from the book. When I checked the bibliography, I just saw the two articles. And he gives his view as to why the allegorical reading doesn't work. So let me give a little context to it, and I like your response to it. So according to him, the reading of 1 Timothy 2:15, if you read it as allegorical, he says it uses language from Genesis 2 and 3 to say something new, and that this quote misses the purpose of the summary citations of 1 Timothy 2, verse 13 and 14, which results in a disconnect between Paul's statement in 1 Timothy 2:15 and its Old Testament background. Paul was using a well-known story in 1 Timothy 2:13 and 14, where he talks about Adam and Eve being deceived and in the transgression. So he's using a well-known story, using a common rhetorical technique. He was not teaching something new. So his point is that if you're saying it's allegory, then now Paul is teaching something new, and it disconnects verse 13 and 14 from verse 15. And he states that verse 15 continues the same themes in order to offer an explanation of how she will be saved from her transgression. It will be through, quote, the childbearing. He says the allegorical view misses all of that. He also states that the virtuous children view doesn't work because technogonia is not used in Genesis 3:16. Instead, it's texe techna, and that tikto would have been better for an allegory interpretation than technogonia. So we can go through this a little bit at a time, but I wanted to say, what do you think of this? And what's your response to him saying, yeah, if you're saying it's allegory, you're saying Paul is introducing something new and it disconnects verse 13 and 14 from verse 15. Your response.
yeah. But basically, yeah. The writer here misses the point on so many different levels. It's kind of hard to know where to begin. First of all, it would not have been new to them. It would not have been new to them. They, like I said, they would have been very well versed and familiar with Paul's technique here. Secondly, what Paul was trying to do was solve the problem of false teaching uh, in in uh, in Ephesus.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, if he was doing something new, it was that, and everything Paul writes is new from that point of view. So basically, that criticism doesn't make much sense, and the whole thing uh, about Paul not using the term technogonia, no, about the yeah, Genesis
Mm-hmm. Two and three.
3:16. Yeah, Genesis doesn't use that term.
Yeah.
Uh, and of course, he's talking about the Septuagint version
Mm-hmm.
of Genesis, the Greek version
Right.
of, of Genesis, not the Hebrew version of Genesis. But again, that makes no difference at all. The term technogonia was a rare term. There are a few people in Greek literature who use the term, but we would not expect it to be used everywhere. Paul could have easily have used another term for
Mm-hmm.
childbearing. There were multiple
Mm-hmm.
terms for childbearing that Paul could have used, and to the same effect, because the term technogonia itself is not specifically an allegorical term. It's just a common term for childbearing. And Paul could have used several terms for childbearing. The point is how Paul used the term in this specific incident. So
Mm-hmm.
so that the criticism is just it's kind of off center and kind of out there and doesn't make very much sense to me. But I understand what he was doing. I mean, he had to get his thesis written. So, but I think his criticism is just kind of a stretch that has very little probative value in terms of my interpretation of that text.
Yeah, because I was reading over his argument, and I looked at it and I went, the idea that Paul is introducing something new. His view is that the childbearing, because he looks at the definite article and he goes, the childbearing is referring to what God said to Eve,
Yeah,
or to to Eve, that you shall have pain or anguish in conceiving, and in pain you shall bring forth children. He sees that as that's what Paul is referring to, and that and I just looked at it and I went, well, wait a minute. I
yeah,
said, every scholar I've read said, yeah, that definite article, it could be interpreted different ways, and it doesn't even have to be interpreted in order to make the point. And then, but the idea that Paul is introducing something new by using the allegorical method, I went, that didn't make sense to me. I said, because if you follow your argument in the book, Paul is utilizing Adam and Eve in an allegorical fashion,
yeah, yeah.
and then it moves into speaking allegorically of childbirth. I went, that's not something new. He is continuing the same theme and same technique of using allegory throughout. So it's actually consistent. It's not introducing something new.
Right, that's right, right. And this is not the only place in the Pauline corpus where Paul uses allegorical interpretation. He does
Right.
it in 1 Corinthians 10. He does it in Galatians chapter 4. So it's a technique that they would have been familiar with. And again, like I said, especially in that particular culture. So nothing really new there. Also, you mentioned the use of the article "the," which
Mm-hmm.
also is a misuse. Actually, what Paul is doing here is what we call the generic article,
Yeah.
which we don't translate in
Yeah.
in
And you talk
English.
about that in the book.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it's there in Greek, but when we translate it into English, we usually omit it. For example, I think I mentioned 1 Timothy 6:12,
Mm-hmm.
where Paul says, "Fight the good fight of
Mm-hmm.
faith."
Mm-hmm.
Hold on to eternal life. Now, in the Greek, is fight the good fight of the faith.
Mm-hmm.
Hold on to the eternal life. But we don't say that. We don't say fight the good fight of the faith. We just say fight the good fight of faith,
Mm-hmm.
and hold on to eternal life, not the eternal life. So that's the use of the generic article. So those who try to particularize this article, the childbirth, is just misreading that entire
Yeah.
Greek
And
usage.
and I thought it was interesting for him to make the argument. Well, he says, well, technogonia is never used in an allegorical fashion. I thought, well, that doesn't prove anything. No.
No,
I
no, no.
said, I said, it just means nobody else did that.
Sure.
But we see the question I wanted to ask you too. I thought about this. I didn't put it in the notes I sent you. Is it also possible, because we know that Paul utilizes, especially in First Timothy and throughout his letter, but he utilizes at times rare words, or once it's a hapax legomena.
Yeah.
Um, could it be that one of the reasons Paul uses technogonia is because, which is a rare term, I think we only have what, four references in other writings of the term being used. Could it be that, because I was reading an article by a scholar named Jamin Hubner, he was writing about he was writing about the word authentain or authenteo when Paul
Yeah,
talked about I do not permit a woman to have authority or
authority.
usurp
Yeah,
authority. And he made a really good point, and he didn't say this is absolutely the case. He says, but he was basically suggesting, could it be that Paul is utilizing these rare terms because he wants to call attention to something that normally, if you utilize the other terms, it could have not necessarily called attention, but by utilizing these rare terms, it causes that are very rarely used. It causes people kind of to sit up and go, "Oh, he's communicating something here that we got to pay attention to." Is that a possibility?
yeah. I think that's a good point. That's a good point. Paul is using the terms in a special categorical way, and he uses a rare term in order to call attention to that. So I think that's what's going on with technogonia, uh, especially the way he interprets it allegorically, is he's actually referring to a different category of childbirth there.
Mm,
He's calling attention to salvific childbearing, not ordinary childbearing. So as I say in my book, his use of the term has categorizing force, but not particularizing force.
mm,
So he's using that term as a special category of childbearing, namely the type of childbearing that results in salvation, and that has nothing to do with the birthing of literal human children,
mm-hmm,
but metaphorical or spiritual children,
mm-hmm.
namely the very children he mentions in that verse. So that's why he would use that rare term. But it's also important to note he's not the only one who's used that term. You
Right,
know, yeah, Hippocrates used that term,
right.
Aristotle used that term, Galen used that term, and even later in history, Johannes Tobias used that term. So he's not the only one who uses that term.
Mm-hmm.
So the term existed. The term
Right,
existed already
right.
before Paul. He just pulled it from his vocabulary
Mm-hmm.
and used it because it sharpened his point even
Yes.
more to use it that way.
Yeah, I believe that's the case. I believe so we got two questions left. So now we come back to First Timothy 2:15. How, from your reading, your understanding, all that we've talked about thus far, how should we understand what Paul is saying in First Timothy 2:15? What's the message that Paul is communicating, especially first and foremost to the Ephesian women?
Yeah, he is saying to the Ephesian women, uh, and for that matter to the Ephesian men as well, is that and of course the problem with the Ephesian women was that they were being misled by false teaching,
Right.
So basically, as Paul is saying, salvation is available to you. Salvation is available to you uh, through faith, through
Mm-hmm.
faith, through holiness, through temperance, through love. Salvation is available to you. Just cast off this false teaching and hold on to faith. Give birth to faith,
Mm-hmm.
holiness, temperance, love. Give birth to that. So actually, it's not only a saving message, but I think it's also an empowering and liberating message as well for those Ephesian women and for women today in
Mm-hmm.
in the 21st century. So that's what I would want people to walk away
Okay.
from this verse.
So could we say that what Paul was telling them was, yes, you're saved by Christ, but as you produce and walk in these virtues, you're showing that you are staying in the faith. You
The
are
same,
staying
yeah,
committed, faithful to God by these virtues that you are producing. Would that be accurate to say?
yeah. That's accurate. It's as Paul also says in First Timothy, work out your soul salvation with fear and trembling.
In
So
Philippians, that's Philippians
Oh, I'm sorry,
2.
Philippians. Yeah,
Yeah.
Philippians. Yeah, Philippians. Work out your soul salvation through fear
Yes.
and trembling.
Yes.
So it's as what's his name? Ed Sanders says it's about getting in and staying in.
Staying in,
Yeah,
right?
getting in and staying in. In his book called "In Palestinian Judaism."
Well,
So you get in and you stay in. So in other words, we're not saved by works. We're
right.
saved by faith. But yet, because we're saved by faith, we produce we produce good works.
Right.
And producing those good works is laying up treasures in heaven. So in the pastoral epistles, we kind of have this idea that 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 good works are the result of salvation,
Mm-hmm.
but they are they're the result of realized salvation, but they're prerequisite for eschatological salvation. So
Okay.
so you have salvation in the here and now, but then we are saved in the end because we did good work. So in other words, Paul has no problem with good works. I mean,
Right.
sometimes we misinterpret Paul
Right.
on that point. He rejects ritual works
Mm-hmm.
like circumcision,
Mm-hmm.
dietary rules,
Mm-hmm.
and cultic calendar observances. He is
Mm-hmm.
saying, no, we're not saved by those kind of
Mm-hmm.
works. But he does not dismiss the value of the works of love and justice and mercy
Right.
and kindness. Those, we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ in 2 Corinthians, and the judgment seat of God in Romans 14. But it's the same judgment seat, and we shall give an account for the deeds done in his body. So Paul
Yes.
does have a place for good works.
Right.
So yeah, so it's a very liberating and empowering message, I think.
So I want to ask a real quick question where that's concerned. How does that also, or does it relate to when Paul in the same epistle, First Timothy, tells Timothy, well, let me back up for a second. So the women are to produce virtuous works. It seems that that's connected to them learning, that they were to learn, which they would be learning what Paul calls sound doctrine.
Yeah,
Sound doctrine would produce this virtuous behavior,
yeah,
right?
that's right.
Paul tells Timothy later, get don't pay attention to these myths,
Right.
but stay focused on, pay attention to uh, doctrine, and to the sound doctrine by which you will save yourself and those who are listening to you.
Yeah,
Is is that along the same lines?
that's it. Yeah, that's it. Exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
I just want to make sure I was reading you correctly.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Because when I first read your work, I'm going, my mind immediately jumped to when Paul said to Timothy, give heed to, your reading, the sound doctrine, and you will save both yourself and those who are listening. I'm going, wait a minute. That's basically what he said to the
Well,
women when he said, listen, quit interrupting, listen. And then it goes, and what are they listening to? They're listening to sound doctrine, help,
yeah.
which in the first century context relates to, the way that term was used, that which would produce virtuous behavior, that which would, the philosophers would say, the soundness, it would heal them of the vices, and it would end up producing virtuous behavior. And I'm looking, so this is why when I read your work, I'm going, this makes perfectly good sense to me in terms of what's being communicated.
Right. Right. And that's why Paul gave the instructions that he gave. He says
Yes.
he says Adam was formed first, by
Yes.
which he means the Ephesian men became Christians first, and then the women became Christians later, and that
Mm-hmm.
and that was just part of a cultural thing. But because the women were so young in the faith, they were susceptible to being misled by whoever these false preachers
Yes.
that invaded Ephesians were, and most likely the false preachers were men as well
Yeah.
who came in, and so that's why Paul told them and only them, just that specific group, that to keep silent, submit yourself to the more seasoned men in the community, and being endowed with sound doctrine, in order to overcome the effects of the false teaching. So again, a very context specific solution to a context specific situation there in Ephesus, and we have to be careful about trying to apply this universally to
Yes.
all people and in all time. That's a mistake that the complementarian school is making, and it's a mistake that people have been making for centuries.
Dr. Waters, when I was studying this, and when I taught, and by the way, when I taught on this, I came to the same conclusions. I went, Paul is not talking to all women at all times in all places everywhere. He's talking to the specific Ephesians women, and that the men there are in all likelihood the teachers that they are to be listening to.
Right.
One of the other things, this is what excited me about your work when I found it, is one of the things I had been teaching, and this is before I found your work. I said, when you start looking at verse 9, when Paul, well, actually verse 8, when he tells the men to lift up holy hands without anger and disputes. And saying when you read all the way down, there's this constant move away from vice to virtue.
Yeah.
You see that constantly. He tells the women, don't wear certain clothes because that
Yeah.
can be seen as the vice. Instead, you'd put on self-control, moderation, and women, you're not to be those specific women. Don't be arguing. Listen to the men in silence and which is also a virtue. I said there's this constant move from vice to virtue, from vice to virtue. So
Yeah.
when I was reading your work and you said, yeah, verse 15 is calling them, I went, oh my gosh, this fits the context as I've been reading it. It
Right.
is a call to virtue.
Call the word. Right. Right. Yeah. Particularly in that culture. Again,
Yes.
we have to recognize the influence of the culture.
Yes.
And basically what Paul is saying to her, you need to separate yourself from uh, the Ephesian culture and the way Ephesian women usually dress and behave
Right.
in this particular culture. And so because that's all part of the negative influence that's being exerted upon this weaker group
Yes.
of Christians. So all the things about how you dress, how you wear your hair. Again, the specific point is separate yourself from the culture.
Yes.
Don't be sucked in, and basically don't be sucked into the Artemis cult, by
Hmm.
the way, and the way they
Yes.
do things. So that's what Paul is battling against in
Yes.
First Timothy.
Now, one other, I got two more, and then we're done. So the question I had, do you have about 5 more minutes?
Oh, John, yeah, take your
Okay.
time.
So my other question is this then. So Paul is calling these women to virtue. Then he goes into chapter 3 and he starts talking about if anyone desires the office of an elder or desires to be an elder, he desires that they desire a good thing. My question is this, because he's talking about virtue. When you start looking at the qualifications for the elder, it's all about virtue and character.
Sure. Yes.
And I'm wondering, is Paul connecting that saying, okay, you women who have wanted to operate as leaders, if you walk in this virtue, okay, you want to be a leader, this is what it takes. It takes virtue. Is there, you see what I'm saying about the
Sure.
connection
Sure.
between the two? It's not like he's all of a sudden, okay, let's start a new topic. But
Well,
that he continues on with this idea of
yeah.
leadership and teaching, because he talks about you got to be apt to teach, but he also talks about virtuous behavior.
Yeah. I mean, the central component of the pastoral epistles is character formation.
Yes.
I mean, that's what it's all about. So you're right. You just see that theme consistently from verse 1 to the very last verse in the pastoral epistles. Paul is calling them to virtuous character. That is sort of the foundation of leadership in the Christian church. Not just the Ephesian church, but the Christian church.
So then he would not be in 1 Timothy 2:12, he would not be excluding the women from leadership. He would actually be laying out for them a path to leadership.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. I think you're right there. You're right. Yeah, you're right. Everything. I mean, and in the rest of First Timothy, you see this theme of inclusiveness. I mean,
Yes.
it is God's will that all be saved.
Yes.
So God is interested in the all, both men and women. I mean, there's a dichotomy between Jew and Gentile, but there's no dichotomy between men and women in the pastoral epistle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so with your understanding of this text, Paul is not calling these women to be saved by having children. He's not calling them to be saved by quote good works as we understand that, but he's calling them to virtue.
The
and that
virtue.
as they remain in that, how does this then influence and inform how we understand women in leadership in the church?
I think that what we have here in the pastoral epistles is just a strong affirmation of what we today call the egalitarian view, which means that there are no specific roles differentiated between male and female. We all share the same calling, and based upon our gifts and calling, we respond to the call to God's service. That means all levels of service, all levels of ministry are
Mm,
just as available to women as it is to men. What supports that is the fact that's what Paul practices throughout his epistles. I mean, in Romans chapter 16, we have this whole list of women, and also in Philippians and Corinthians, other lists of women. And what's interesting is that Paul uses the same terms for them that he uses for the men: ministers, fellow prisoners, co-laborers. So it's that egalitarian theme. Now, Paul probably would not have used that
right.
term, but that's what his practice indicates. And that practice is consistent with Jesus. It's
Yes.
consistent with Jesus. So that's some of the kickback that I get when I try to show that no, Paul's practice and attitude toward women is very consistent with Jesus's practice
Yes.
and attitude toward women. And we have to take Paul seriously. Galatians 3:28. In Christ, there's neither Jew nor Greek, bond or free, male and female. We're all one in Christ Jesus. And we need to take Paul seriously on that point.
Amen. Amen. Woo, this has been great. I feel like number one, I need to give you an offering right now. And run around the church. No, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. I'd like you to have the final word. What do you want people to take away from your book and or the interpretation of First Timothy 2:15? What would you like for them to take away?
Yeah, I want them to leave with a message of of liberation and empowerment. I mean,
Mm,
that's the sense that I want them to especially women. One of my chapters in the book is kind of addressing um, especially black women.
hmm
Black women. I think the title of the chapter is waiting for vindication.
hmm
And that's the message for all women, but black women especially have been marginalized and oppressed by erroneous interpretations
Yeah.
of the scripture, like First Timothy 2:15 and First Corinthians 14:34.
Mm,
So I especially want them to walk away from Paul with a sense of liberation and empowerment. Quite frankly, Paul has been given a bad rap. He's been given a
I
bad,
agree. I agree.
uh, and he's continuing to be given a bad rap. And that's yeah. Admittedly, that's part of what I'm fighting against here in my writing. We just cannot allow this misrepresentation and misinterpretation of Paul's thought to stand without challenge. And so I want people to see that and have a sense of how Paul's message empowers and liberates us all, both women and men.
Amen. Well, Dr. Waters, I want to thank you. This has been an absolute joy and enjoyment for me.
But
For
thank you.
the, I mean, I again thank you so much for taking the time. For those of you, again, the book is called Women, Salvation, and Childbearing by Dr. Kenneth L. Waters Sr. I found this on Amazon, so you can buy it there on Amazon. And I would, for those of you, especially if you're studying this topic of egalitarianism, complementarianism, you've been confused by First Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, and the other verses. This book will help to bring some clarity and some understanding. So highly, highly, highly recommend that you get this book. And for those of you watching, also, we just want to say that this, if you're watching this on our Facebook live feed, this will be uploaded to our KIC TV, Keeping in Context TV YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. Please, if you're watching it, let people know about it. If you're watching it on YouTube, click the like button. That helps the algorithm go out. We want to get this message out to more people. So thank you so much again, Dr. Waters. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And everyone, we will see you, Lord willing, next week.
God bless. Thank you very much.
All right, that was the interview. Thank you so much for watching. And as I said, this will be uploaded to our KIC channel and within the next 24 to 48 hours, probably within the next 24 hours. So thank you so much. And if you are watching, please click that like button, share this message with other people. It helps us to spread what we are talking about to more people. So Lord willing, we'll see you next week. Thank you so much, very much for watching. Bye-bye.